Hello and welcome to our notes on cognition and memory. These two units are combined because cognition, we're talking about thinking. So we've talked about cognition a couple times. One was the type of psychology. So a cognitive psychologist would be focusing on thoughts and memory versus like a biology psychologist or biopsychologist would be focusing on like the brain structures. So now we're going to look at how we make memories. Not only how we make memories, but how we access those memories and what makes something a short-term memory or long-term memory. Why do we forget things? Why do we not remember certain other things? So I had you outline this chapter and you took notes from your peers, but the unit overview, basically you've looked at those 9 units. That's a really long chapter. I've told you there's a ton of vocabulary. There's a lot of different concepts, and they're all makes up about 10% of your AP test. All right, so we're going to look at what is exactly memory, the phenomenon of memory, how we process information, why we forget certain things, and how we construct memories, and then ways to actually improve our memories, which maybe we should have done first so that we do better on tests. But how can you purposely make your memories better? All right, so we're going to start out with these notes with the phenomenon of memory. So what do we define memory as in psychology? Warning, there will be pop-ups. All right, some of you are getting mad because you say, I'm not leaving notes in my room or room in my notes because it's not on the screen. So I will be adding pop-ups. So anytime you see words, especially these ones here that are blue, those are vocabulary words. Let me go down. See, all vocabulary words. So when you see words in blue, make sure you leave space to write. All right, the stuff in black I will give examples of. So if you're not using your margins very well, maybe you can start writing your examples in the margins. Okay, so memory. When we learned about learning, we talked about that a learned behavior is a relatively permanent change in behavior. And memory is just a relatively permanent learning. Okay, so a memory is when you remember that you've learned. A relatively permanent change in learning has occurred. That is our working definition of memory. Now we have some really extremes of memory, and some of the really interesting things, case studies that we'll talk about during memory are people that have things like amnesia or short-term memory. But some case studies, really interesting case studies with extremes of memories. People who are unable to make new memories. So older people who have strokes, like 90-year-olds who have a stroke, might remember everything in detail till they were 85. And then for some reason, after a damaged part of their brain, they're not able to make any new memories. So if you've ever seen like 50 First Dates. Versus someone who remembers everything. So there's a man that I'll have you guys read about in your book who remembered everything that happened. He could memorize these long list of words, and 15 years later when you asked him about that list of words, he remembered like who asked him, where he was at, and could remember all the words even though he had learned hundreds and hundreds of different lists in between. There's also an extreme of a man who could recite the first 1,000 digits of pi or something like that. So extremes of memory. Why do some people remember so much versus some little? Okay, so information processing, how we actually take in information and put it into our brain. So we're going to learn a couple different models. I want you to look at this word model here. We've talked about this word a couple times, but a model is just a connection of ideas that is used or can be used to explain a new situation. So the Atkinson-Shiffrin 3-stage model is the encoding, storage, retrieval model. And this is a model of memory, so how we make memories, why we remember. So encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding is how we actually get things into our brain. Storage is where it's stored or actually put in our brain, making sure that it's encoded properly. And retrieval would then be that last step of getting things out. Right? So new information's coming in. It needs to first of all be stored in our brain, or there'll be no way to remember it. And then we also need to be able to retrieve it. So you've probably had that experience where you know that it's in your brain somewhere, you just are unable to retrieve it. Okay, so this is the Atkinson-Shiffrin 3-stage model. We're going to talk about some alterations to this model, and then we'll talk about this picture here in a few seconds. Okay, so This is based on the idea, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, on this idea of connectionism, meaning that neurons connect in a certain pattern, and that's what makes memories. So connectionism is talking about neurons connecting in certain patterns and pathways to make memories. So there's 3 different types of memories that are under connectionism: sensory memory, short-term, and long-term. These 2 are pretty easy to remember. Sensory memory is all that sense coming in. So you can actually, you have a ton of senses coming into your to your brain right now. You're hearing things, you're seeing things, you're feeling things, and the sensory memory is the things that are like right there as they're coming in. Now that can be shifted into short-term memory, which is sometimes called our working memory. We'll talk about that in a second, where you're able to use it at that moment. So you're able to remember things for a short period of time. And then long-term memory would be making even more connections back in our brain so they're able to get that idea out later. Now, a modified version of the 3-stage process theory is this, this is the modified version of the 3-stage processing model. So before you had encoding, storage, retrieval, now we're going to be calling it sensory, short-term, and long-term, and I'll put those 2 things together for you here in just a second. So the modified version is that's short-term, the sensory, short-term, long-term, and there's some different versions of this 3-stage model. So you don't always have to go to your short-term for it to go to your long-term. Some things go to our long-term immediately. So information directly into long-term memory versus something called a working memory. And working memory is kind of like this, it's an unconscious and it's a conscious effort. So there's things that you're pulling out of your brain unconsciously and things that are coming in consciously right now. Like you're writing down these notes right now, right? You don't have to sit there and remember how to write, but you might need to remember what I just said. You're trying to like just take it out of your working memory, things that are happening right now in the present, and combine that with your old memory, your long-term memory of how to write or how to spell things that you hear, and it's a combination of the 2. So I'm going to give you a chart. I want you to write this down in order. So make sure you have this chart in your notes. Here's the modified 3-stage processing memory. So I have an external event, meaning that something that happens outside of my body. This can be any type of stimulus. Remember, stimulus means it elicits a response. So it can be a sound, sight, something you hear, which is sound, sorry, something that you feel, something that you taste. You then have your sensory memory. Remember all those senses coming in. You have your working / short-term memory. Remember we just talked about those 2 things that are in your working short-term memory. And then you have your long-term memory. So in that order, sensory, working, long-term. So I have sensory input. My external events are putting input into my sensory memory. For my sensory memory, I pay attention to novel ideas. Novel means new. So I'm paying attention to novel information or important information. You are very good, or your brain is very good, at getting rid of the stuff that it doesn't think is important and focusing on the things that it does think are important. For instance, like I said, you're not like feeling your clothes against you right now, even though there's sensory input, and that's sensory adaptation. But you're able to kind of hone in on what you feel is like important or new. So that process is called encoding. Going back a couple vocab words, encoding, putting stuff in to your working memory. It has to be encoded in order for you to be able to retrieve it. So sometimes we use that word like, oh, I forgot it, or like that term forgetting. If you never encoded it properly, you'll never be able to remember it. And then you have the second part of encoding is moving it from your short term to your long term. So sometimes we're able to encode it into our short term perfectly, but it never encodes into our long term memory. This is where we're going to work on how we remember things better, is getting things from short term to long term. So for instance, you have a pop quiz at the end of psych class on something that you just learned 10 minutes ago. Or of like whiteboards. Have you ever thought, like any of the teachers, even biology or from Mr. Nelson or my class, we used to use whiteboards. So you were listening to a lecture, and then right after there was asked a question on that lecture, and you were able to remember it because it's still in your short-term memory. But the next day, 24 hours later, you weren't able to remember it anymore. So it never got encoded into your long-term memory. Okay? Now, the retrieving process, or getting that information back out, following the pathway or the connections back out, goes from long-term to short-term, right? So it goes back into your working memory, and then from your working memory, you can say it or you can use it, okay? Now, this is all an unconscious process, meaning that you are not thinking about doing these things. It's happening without you thinking about it. If it doesn't, after it's retrieved to go into your short-term or working term, it can go, right, it's still encoded here. So you're not thinking, or I don't want to say that. You have a ton of memories right now in your brain that you're not retrieving, okay? But at certain points, you retrieve them to bring them back into your working or short-term memory, and then they go back into their long-term, or the pathway is still there. All right, but you have to actually retrieve those long-term and bring them into your working memory in order to actually use them or retrieve them. All right, so let's go back to this picture. So this says sensory memory registers incoming information and allowing your brain to capture for a moment a sea of faces. So the sensory input is overwhelming, but if you're looking at this whole sea of faces right here, right, you see faces, but you're probably not focused on anything in particular. And then it says we pay attention and encode important or novel stimulus. So important or new things. In this case, the angry face in the crowd. And then if we stare at the face long enough, which is rehearsal, remember we talked about like practice, or when class was saying like I want you to practice it, I want you to rehearse it, that's like getting it into your brain. Or if we sufficiently disturbed by it, therefore we think it's really disturbing or important, we will encode it into our long-term storage. And we may an hour later be able to come upon this image in our brain. Okay, so this is really disturbing to you, or if you feel like you need to know it. So sometimes you're learning in class, it's not that it's really disturbing to you, you're just like, I need to know this information for the test. So that all of a sudden becomes important information that you are focusing on. Okay, so our next step is we're going to actually focus on just the encoding process, how we get information into our brain. So a lot of people like to compare memories to a computer, and that it takes in its sensory input, it stores it somewhere on the computer, and then you have to go and retrieve it from a file to get it back. And that's a good way to try and remember memory, but human brains are a lot more complicated than that. So we have these automatic things going on that you're not even aware of. Automatic thing that you're not even aware of, and we do that with something called parallel processing and automatic processing. So we're not like computers in that, even though I just explained how you make a memory is like this sequential, I want to say process, that it goes like serial, like 1, 2, 3, 4. It may be doing that, but we have a ton of things going on at the same time. So our brain is constantly doing something called parallel processing, which is where we're constantly taking things in and bringing things out at the same time. So parallel, happening at the same time. And throughout our day, we're encoding information that we're not even trying to. I know that sounds kind of odd, but our brain is just kind of putting things back. This is called automatic processing, that you're not even aware of. Then you're not paying attention to. You're not putting an effort into remembering it. So the first thing that you automatically process is space, meaning that if you are copying, let's see, like on your book, and you're like looking at a sentence and you go to copy it down, you automatically remember to glance back at that same spot the next time. Even though you didn't say, remember that it's halfway through the book where you were copying. Your brain is kind of always keeping track of like space of things, like looking for things in the same place. Time, even though you're not consciously trying to like put things in order throughout the day. Let's say you get to third period and you can't find your backpack. You can actually go back in your brain and go, okay, I was in health class, and before that I went to the bathroom, and then I was hanging out at the lawn. And you can go back and remember the events of your day or the time things happened, even though right now you're not trying to memorize that, right? So that's automatic processing. Your brain automatically kind of keeps sequences. Frequency. You might run into someone and be like, oh, this is the 4th time I've seen you today, even though you weren't like counting, like being like, oh, I saw you 1, 2, 3, 4 times. You can just kind of automatically recall that you saw that person 4 times. And then well-learned information, things that are in your brain that you know really well, like your native language. If you see a word on the side of a truck without you even trying to, like you read it, right? You can't stop your brain from reading it. That's called automatic processing. Your brain is constantly keeping track of things that you're not even aware of. Now, this is in contrast to effortful processing. So think about those words, automatic. You automatically do it. You don't even have to pay attention to it. Versus effortful processing, that is when you are purposely trying to remember something. Okay, so your friend just told you her new phone number and you need to go somewhere and write it down. You're going to try and remember that phone number, right? So you're like 8675309, 8675309. That's a rehearsal. It's a conscious repetition trying to get it into your long-term memory. So effortful processing is where you have to make a conscious effort into trying to encode the information. Like this. You don't naturally remember all these vocabulary words. You're trying to put them in. We've talked about the Ebbinghaus curve. It's the forgetting curve. And we're going to look at that here in just a second. But it's up in the room. It's how often we forget things if they're not rehearsed. That's our studying curve. Okay, so there's two different types of encoding. The automatic, like you can think right now, what did you eat for dinner yesterday? What did you have for lunch? Who's the last person you talked to? You can retrieve those things automatically because your brain kind of stores them, even though you weren't trying to memorize it. Versus effortful, you're trying to remember, oh my gosh, what does even encoding mean? That's an effortful process. You're trying to remember this unit's concepts. This is the Ebbinghaus curve. This is how we, if we don't repeat it, how much it goes down, so the forgetting curve. And then this is how many times you need to repeat it in order to maintain that learning. So what this says, it says time in minutes to relearn a list on day 2. So if I gave you 20 vocabulary words to memorize on day, let's see, on number of repetitions on the list on day 1. So 8 repetitions took you 20 minutes. All right, 16, hold on just a second. I'm mixing up my graphs here. Okay, so this is the Ebbinghaus curve. This is actually the number of repetitions. This is not the forgetting curve that we have in class. Sorry. This is the Ebbinghaus curve of repetitions. So Ebbinghaus, think repetitions. Keep saying that. Ebbinghaus, repetition. Ebbinghaus, repetition. And what he was saying is that he found a correlation between the number of repetitions. They repeated a list of words on day 1. So if he repeated it 8 times that day, the second day, it took him 20 minutes to relearn the same list. Okay, so I only repeated it 8 times. It took me 20 minutes the next day. Versus if he repeated it 64 times on day 1, the next day it only took like 7 minutes to relearn it. All right, so the more times you repeat or repetitions you have on the first day, the more likely you are able to, or the less time it's going to take to get that out of your brain. You guys are really good at this. So when I have you practice, when you just practiced your finals, I could tell some of you were done with your midterm in 3 minutes because you had repeated those things so many times that you were very quickly able to recall them. Versus someone that only studied a few times, it took them longer to get the same answers. You might have still done well, but it took more time. So we'll learn more about effortful encoding in our next notes. So from these notes, I want you to take away what is the 3-stage theory, how it works with the working memory, the sensory memory, the long-term memory, so that chart, and then the difference between automatic processing and effortful processing. Our next notes will focus more on what happens, what we need to do when we're effortfully processing information, trying to encode it.